Secretary, Head of Department, Officers from Municipal throughout Malaysia. Our facilitator, Mr. Jeffrey Delmon and Mr. Abhijit Baumik. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 5th session of the Leadership Training for Municipality on Public-Private Partnership towards Development of Smart Cities. Today, our facilitator will provide lesson on leadership skill in public-private partnership, and we'll have discussion on the municipal readiness self-assessment. Also appreciate for those who haven't responded to our survey. Please do, because this will really help us to focus and prepare for the upcoming trainings in future. Now, I would like to hand over to Jeffrey to conduct the session. Over to you, Jeffrey.
Thank you, Anusha, and welcome everyone. Hope everyone had a fantastic couple of days. You got lots of work done and had time to rest and relax, and now that you are ready for day 4 of our Smart Cities and PPP training. For those of you who have survived this long, there may be some questions outstanding. I wanted to give a chance to everyone to raise some quick questions now before we start our session. And while you're thinking of your questions and writing them down in the chat, let me tell you a little bit about today. So we're going to start with a bit of a presentation on leadership and what it takes to drive not just a PPP project, but an entire program of activities across a city. And what that means, how leadership can adjust and respond to needs and prepare themselves for all of the different issues that are going to be coming up. And then we've looked through, thank you very much for those who have submitted their Module 1 and Module 2 responses. And so we've used that to identify the areas where there are particular challenges or particular strengths. And we're going to address some of these first for the municipal readiness assessment, and then for the project readiness assessment. Now, in normal situation, as you know, you've seen these 2 different modules, and there you just sort of ticked off, strongly agree, disagree, strongly disagree for each of the different questions. In normal circumstances, you would add on to that a description of your project or the municipal context and explain why you answered this way. That would have been a lot more work, and so we decided to be very nice and just do the ticking the box exercise. But obviously going forward, as you're thinking about using these tools to help you in your projects, for each one of those answers, you'll want to explain exactly why you think that, because these will then be shared with people across the different parts of the municipal government, and it'll give you a chance to debate and discuss and identify opportunities to improve the structure of either the municipal institutional framework or the project itself. So with all of that blah, blah, I think I've given you enough time to write down some questions in the chat. And I see 0 questions. Does that mean you've all got all the answers that you ever wanted? Let me raise one that I know was still outstanding from the last session, which was on credit ratings. And you'll see in the municipal readiness assessment module, there's a bit of discussion around accessing debt and credit ratings. And my sense is from the responses that there aren't too many cities that have even looked at credit ratings. You certainly don't have international credit ratings, nor local. And so this is a new space for you. So apologies if I'm starting from too basic a level. But a credit rating agency is a private company that assesses the risk associated with a given either investment, loan, project, or entity. And more often it's the entity. So you will have credit ratings for a company, for a government, a city, for a sovereign government. I would say I don't know, maybe half of sovereign governments have credit ratings. These credit ratings are developed by this private company and then shared so that investors thinking about investing in for instance, the Malay government. The Malay government has an international credit rating, and if the Malay government issues bonds and wants to borrow money from the market, those people interested in buying bonds, Malaysian bonds, will be able to look at the credit rating, and that will give them a sense as to whether this is a risky investment. And so from that description, you can imagine what the credit rating agencies do when they come to visit you. If you're willing to have a credit rating, then you provide them with information and you respond to their questions. They will come and visit you and ask you a lot of questions. And those questions will be around your financial situation. It'll be around your accounting procedures. It'll be around your history of paying your debts and paying your suppliers and service providers. They'll look at all the different pieces of your organization that will tell them whether you are a good risk. And so if you have a system that identifies contingent liabilities and manages those contingent liabilities, you manage your debt well, you've always paid your debt on time, all of those kind of things, that will improve your credit rating. And that's the basis on which this agency issues its rating. These rating agencies are not regulated internationally. And so it's all about their reputation, and which is the only thing they have to trade on. So their reputation is going to be very important to them. So they're going to want to be very thorough in the assessment that they do of your situation before they provide you with this rating. You can also hire a firm, a consulting firm can come in and do a shadow rating. And this is just for you. And it gives you a chance to look at the way a credit rating agency would look at your situation, your city, for example, and test whether the results are going to be what you think they would want to be, and give you an idea of areas that you can improve in order to improve your credit rating. So that can be it's obviously expensive, so you've got to spend the money. You've got to spend the money on somebody good that will give you a real sense of what that rating will be. There's no guarantee that the rating will be what they say it's going to be, but it's a good exercise of going through. It's not entirely dissimilar, those of you that know doing business, the World Bank Group assessment of countries on the ease of doing business. And so going through all the different issues around how easy it is for a company to engage, to set up a local subsidiary, to hiring people, to all of those kind of things, repatriating profits, etc. All of those kind of questions. And there are facilities to help you look at doing business, the ease of doing business, and improving that rating, so that each year they do a rating of countries around the world on their ease of doing business, and it enables you to leapfrog up that list. And the same thing with credit ratings. There are a lot of ways to improve yourself to get a better credit rating. Still no other questions. So if I don't hear anything else, don't see anything on the chat. Hold on, let me just scroll down. Blah, 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 blah. Nope. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start talking about leadership. And but please do pop a question in the chat if you would like to ask a question as we go. And as usual, it's much more interesting if you ask questions rather than just listening to me talk. So let me talk a little bit about leadership. And I think this came out in our panel session yesterday. Leadership for PPP is absolute, and for smart cities is absolutely essential. Not just the buy-in from important people, but leadership that trickles all the way down through the organization. So, and as you know, the usual, people get very excited about projects. They get very excited about big programs of projects. They get excited about mobilizing financing, but all of the other work underneath that goes into building up these projects often gets lost. And unfortunately, that's a little bit what leadership is like. Sometimes the leaders get recognized, but a lot of that leadership, it's often not as visible as it should be. So let me run through a couple of the focuses for leadership in PPP. Clarity, transparency, certainty. PPP is a totally new way of doing business for city governments. You're not looking at a city delivered solution, you're looking at a city plus private sector delivered solution. So it's that partnership. And that partnership is often a very new concept for city government officials. The clarity, transparency, certainty provides a clear approach, a clear set of rules. Here's how we're going to do this. Here's the way this works. And that helps staff within the city understand what's going on, but also mitigates risk for them, makes them more comfortable. When they know what the rules are, they know how to approach it, and they know that even though what they're doing is a little bit different than what they're used to doing, it's okay because here are the rules of the game and here's how it's supposed to be done. In the same way, the city leadership needs to express support for this concept. And it's that commitment of the municipal government. And sometimes you need that commitment from central government as well, just to show that this is an important approach. Here are the advantages. Here's why we're doing this. And this is the way we want to do business for particular projects or services. And then this then empowers the people underneath you, empowers the staff that you want to empower in order to deliver on these projects. And so so you're setting the policies and procedures, you're setting the rules of the game, and this gives comfort for your government staff. It also gives comfort for investors. And investors, you're asking them to come in and spend a lot of money to understand the city, to understand the project, and then to bid for the project. And those bids are expensive. Relative to the total value of the project and relative to the amount of profit that the entities that the successful bidder is going to make. So if a bidder comes in and sees a project and an opportunity and goes after it, they'll need to think about the cost of going after it, but also the likelihood of winning. And the likelihood of winning is not just there are 4 different competitors and I'm bidding against 4 different people, and I kind of know who those 4 different people are, so I understand what the risks are and what I need to do to win. But in addition to that, there are significant risks that this project falls away, that government decides not to do it, that government decides to do it using some other mechanism. So another government comes in and says, the United States, since that's where I'm from, the US government comes in, they have a nice chat. President Trump comes in and has a chit chat with the government in Malaysia. And all of a sudden this project is taken away from PPP and given to some American company. Or a state-owned enterprise comes in and says, I want that project. Or the city government decides, I don't want to do competitive. I just want to hand it to my friend who has a company and he can do it. All of those are realities. All of those happen all over the world. So any investor is going to ask itself, what is the risk of this? And your leader, that leadership, and it's not just one person, obviously, that leadership will demonstrate and will show by their commitment, by their setting of rules and procedures, by their consistency, will show the investors that they don't need to worry about that and that risk is low. That then results in more bidders, more competition, and a cheaper project. The leadership also needs to coordinate, and this can get super challenging, right? And it's typical for most of these infrastructure style projects. Coordinating amongst different players can be challenging, but now you've got a private entity and there's a temptation to say, all right, I've got a PPP, the private company is going to come and they're going to go and knock on everybody's door and sort all this stuff out. All the environmental approvals, all the construction permits, all that kind of stuff, private sector can do that. That may be, and they may be very good at that and they may be able to do it well. It would be unfortunate for the city to say, I don't have to deal with this anymore. I'm going to let them run with it, right? Because the power of the PPP is private plus public. together the strengths of each. So the public sector needs to be in there helping to move those permits. After all, if the permits is slow, if the licensing is slow, then it just slows your service down, your project. So the municipality needs to be in there to help to coordinate amongst all these different stakeholders and interest parties and make sure the private sector understands who to talk to, who to engage with. Maybe you let them do the lion's share of the heavy lifting, the hard work, but you need to guide them. You need to help them understand who to talk to and what to do. Excuse me for just 1 second. Okay, great. Sorry, glass of water. So coordination, and the coordination also helps you achieve that consistency, right? So if you, within your department, you've set the procedures and processes, you've got your level of consistency, so people are comfortable with this PPP concept. But then you go to other departments, or maybe you need to go to the National Environmental Regulator or the National Procurement Office, or some other office outside of the city. All of that needs to be coordinated, and it's likely better driven or at least supported by the city rather than the private sector. So that leadership is going to be important in guiding the partnership, but also helping to interface with all of these different stakeholders. And finally, and not finally, there's a whole other list of things, obviously, but funding is going to be important. So when you start the project, there will be more enthusiasm and more recognition of the government's commitment to the project if there is funding set aside for the preparation of that project and for the transaction process. And then finally, for the government's contribution. If there are lots of promises, but no visible money behind those promises, the promises may not ring true. And so good leadership thinks about not just the human resource, the institutional resource, the political angle, but also financial, and make sure that the funding is there and that money is set up in advance so that you can move forward with the project and gets everybody comfortable that the project will move forward. So we've tried a couple different slides, and you've got these slides so you can look at these later, but to sort of map out what this looks like and different ways to help leaders think about these different pieces of the pie, right? There's the policy angle, the project selection, preparation, the sort of technical side, the revenue stream, credit enhancement, the financing side, and then the access to financing. And sometimes there is a need for support. For instance, in Malaysia, I know you've got some very proactive institutional investors that have been very supportive of the national PPP program. Are those financiers available to come in? And if you can at least get them warmed up to the project as you're going out to private investors, those private investors then, when they go to knock on the doors of different financiers locally, they will find an open door because those financiers are already aware of your project. And so again, leadership, guiding the project through this process and being proactive, not sitting back and waiting, but being proactive. And this is just a slightly more detailed version of that, looking at the different pieces. And you'll see the same, the framework, the policy framework, government buy-in, oversight, project selection. Oh, sorry, on the framework, one issue that I would note is conflict resolution. This is one where leadership is absolutely essential. PPP is like marriage. There is no marriage without conflict. There is no PPP without conflict. It is a partnership, which means you will have different ideas, different ways of approaching things. So when conflict arises, the worst thing to do is to ignore it and to look the other way or hope it goes away. Don't put your head in the sand like an ostrich. Find a way of solving, addressing the conflict. And if you address it early, it will be much easier to manage. If that conflict festers and gets worse and worse and becomes a dispute, or then becomes an arbitration or a court case, then the cost of resolving that conflict is massive and may undermine the project. But resolving that conflict early, not only do you avoid the cost of the dispute, potential dispute, but you also strengthen the relationship. If the private sector has an issue or a problem and they come and talk to you about it, and you help them resolve that conflict, that then increases in their eyes your trustworthiness. And vice versa. If you create an opportunity for the private sector to help you address issues as they come up, then that improves, that strengthens your relationship, and that increases their trustworthiness in your eyes. That's a great opportunity to resolve, to improve the partnership and to improve the PPP, but it's one that is often missed because government, nobody likes conflict. Nobody wants to talk about these things, right? We all want them to just go away. And in PPP, for some reason, people think, well, public is there and private is here, and we just do our own thing and we don't worry about the other one. And sometimes that works, but it's not great. The best way is to bring the two together and to move forward in partnership. And leadership is absolutely essential in this because the leader needs to be willing to look at conflict and to help resolve conflict and not back away from it and not say, don't talk to me unless it's a really bad situation. What you want is those early conflicts so that you can resolve them together and be proactive in your leadership. And that sort of links over to the box on the far right, which is about regulatory issues. And leadership is essential in regulating the activities, making sure that regulations are sensible and practical, making sure that the risk to the government and to the project are well managed. The better they're managed, the better people are going to feel about the project, the more confident everybody's going to be in the project, the more confident financiers and investors will be, so the cheaper your investment costs will be. Fiscal risk is a huge issue. Every PPP project creates some form of fiscal risk for the government. Either there's termination compensation or some other indemnity for certain risks that the government's going to carry. Think about those things in advance. Know what your fiscal risks are. Know how they're going to be managed. Make sure that if you need to set funding aside or budget aside to address those, you do that. If there's a need to put this into your accounts or otherwise account for it or monitor it, then do so. And the more you do that, the stronger the project gets, the more confident everyone gets in the project. And we talked earlier about rating agencies. The more comfortable rating agencies are going to be because they see that you're being very careful and mature and you're taking this systematically. You're addressing all of these issues. And so that regulatory interface is going to be very important. In some cases, the sector in which this project is being developed doesn't have a natural regulatory mechanism, right? There's no clear regulation. So the regulation can be developed through the contract. So the performance regime in the contract can double up as sort of a regulatory mechanism. Or you create a separate regulatory mechanism, in particular if you're planning on having a bunch of other projects in the same sector. So those regulatory issues need to be thought about in advance. Okay, sorry, just checking for questions. Still, everyone is comfortable, confident, you're understanding everything. Okay, and by the way, if nobody has questions, I reserve the right to reach out and I'm going to go down the chat list and just choose somebody and ask you questions. So this look at it later, this was my effort at putting all these different pieces in there so that it's almost like an aide-memoire. It reminds you to look at these different things as you're developing different angles of the project, but it's way too complicated for us. One comment, and this is especially in times like this, where we are at the moment, in an economy that is going crazy, and we have not seen the bottom of the crazy. I'm afraid there's a lot more crazy to come. and the nature of government finances, of city finances, of investor finances, of financier finances. Everyone's going to be affected by this, and we're going to have to adjust and be very flexible to be able to respond to this, to our current situation. There are ways that, and as investors are asked to put money into more and more things, in particular as governments need to borrow more money to resolve their problems, and as companies need to borrow more money in order to resolve their issues, and as the debt crisis, which has not really reached a head yet, but which is coming fast, there are a lot of countries that have massive debt issues. And post-COVID, there are going to be a lot of companies that have to deal with debt issues. All of this is going to put some stress on the financial markets. Now, it's not like the global financial crisis. It's not the financial markets themselves that are the problem, but we're going to be asking for that, what financing is available, and there's a lot of it, to be funneled in different directions. There's likely to be a flight to quality, which is when investors can be more picky. They need to be more picky because the perceived risks in the market are higher, because there are more and more opportunities to invest. So they need to choose amongst a huge number of different options and opportunities. And so it's only the highest quality opportunities that will receive any attention. Now, I don't mean just the highest credit rating, because the higher the credit rating, the less you make off the investment, right? The cheaper the money is at a higher credit rating. So a lower credit rating gives you higher return opportunities, but still the quality of those lower credit rated opportunities needs to increase. All right, so we need to improve the quality of our projects as we bring them to market if we want to get the right investors and we get the right attention. And that's going to be even more so over the next couple of years. There are ways for government to funnel or to provide funding and financial support to increase the quality of different projects. And so this is just a map, and you'll see this more in the guidelines. There's a lot more detail on these different instruments and ways of doing things. But this maps out over the time frame of a typical project, from preparation to bidding to construction operation. And funding from government comes in early for project development, right? So there may be money from central government or from the municipal government, extra funding for a department if that department looks at PPP and brings in private investment, because it's good for the finances of the city, but the department's budget might not benefit from the advantage of private investment. If that makes sense. The advantage of private investment accrues to the city, but it may not accrue to the budget of the individual department because of the budgeting mechanisms and incentive mechanisms. So government, municipal or central government, can often provide incentives for government, for departments or municipal or ministries to or SOEs to approach to use private investment. One is project development funding. Another is funding into the actual cost of the project. So what is often called viability gap funding, which is a term out of India, but basically a capital grant, a grant amount to bring down the cost of construction, or a guarantee amount, so guaranteeing part of the revenue stream, or even supporting to provide debt later on. And the city can either provide debt directly or can help mobilize debt from another entity. So there may be a guarantee, there may just be an encouragement of some local banks to come in and finance by the city, and the city can help to facilitate this so that it's easier for the private investor to access debt, but it's still the debt of the private sector. So we keep the pressure on the private sector to deliver, but we just facilitate this process through government intervention. So the interfaces are really important, and most of these are going to be very obvious, right? You've got the leadership at the high level, those high level interfaces, both public and private. The interfaces with the contracting authorities, the line departments, and how those different relationships work to make sure that they're all brought together. Treasury, finance, budget, all of these pieces need to be brought in even before you go out to market. So as all of these different bits, the approval of council and making sure the council is on board, oversight bodies, regulators, etc., all of these pieces need to be at least have been contemplated in those discussions commenced before you go out to the market to the private investors, because the investors will want to see all this. They'll want to see that you've already ticked all the boxes, that everybody's on board, that everybody's supportive. And again, that's where this leadership comes into play. The leadership needs to bring together these, and it needs to be coordinated, but it needs to be a joint effort of these different players, these different stakeholders, and that will give great comfort to the investor. And a comfortable investor is more likely to bring money, is more likely to bring less expensive money, and you're likely to get the better investors, the more experienced operators. One thing I'll note is the PPP unit, as I've called it here, but that's a name that's often used at national level, because national governments tend to have so many different projects that it makes sense to set up a separate unit. You'll have a unit of people with technical expertise, with legal expertise, with financial expertise, accounting, business, commercial. You can bring these people together. They will go from project to project, supporting the line ministry or the SOE or whoever to develop that project. And as you aggregate this skill set within this unit, then the lessons learned from one sector are shared with another sector, etc. In some cities are large enough to merit having their own team of people doing this kind of work. In other cities, you have special operations teams, right, which will do PPP, but also any kind of structured financing, any type of highly innovative work. So you've got the very skilled individuals and experienced individuals in this team who can help you deliver on these different projects. Some municipalities, it just doesn't make sense to have any of these teams, but you may have a loose-knit collection of people who have the right experience and who are brought together, a task force, who are brought together to respond and support and reply to questions and help different departments address issues around these projects. And of course, dispute resolution framework, not to be missed out, but very important to look at conflict and disputes and manage them across these different authorities and avoid anything festering and exploding. One of the interesting aspects of PPP, and I guess of life as in a municipal government, is the dynamic between central government and local government. And this is different around the world. Every country is different, and in fact, sometimes the relationship between the city and the central government will be different in different parts of the country. And in particular, larger cities may have different legal situation and mandate. You may be more linked to the provincial government. There are all kinds of different variations. A couple of examples, we worked with St. Petersburg in Russia to develop their PPP team. They had a big program they wanted to do, and so they set up a unit internally, but it had, I think it was 4 or 5 people in this unit who were trained up and linked up with the World Bank so that we could help them develop their capacity. And then we helped them with a couple of their individual projects, and these were massive. I mean, they had a 12 billion euro road that they wanted to develop. They had what was it, 1.2 billion euro airport project that we worked on. So it was some massive projects. And the interesting dynamic there was that the federal government, and because of the relationship between St. Petersburg and the federal government, St. Petersburg is the home of Vladimir Putin. And so there's it's one of the 2 major cities in Russia, so it's got a very different relationship with central government than a lot of the other cities will do. But basically, the federal government gave a lot of space to the local government, let them do their thing. The airport, which is often a federal project, the federal government said, no, you go ahead and do this, and so they gave the city the mandate to try to manage the airport. and to drive the PPP for the airport, which was very successfully done in the midst of the global financial crisis, which was fantastic, but a real testament to the work of the Russian government to comfort investors and to show investors the opportunity to run that airport. And so there were all these big projects, but also a whole bunch of smaller waste management projects and et cetera. And so they created their own PPP unit. Indonesia is a little bit different in that the capacity is largely in the center, and the PPP program has been started at the center, but now is reaching out to the municipal governments. Some of the local governments, like Jakarta, is huge, very wealthy, does its own thing basically. But a lot of the relationship between central and local governments in a lot of the other major cities is obviously more closer, more tight. But the dynamic is really, really interesting. And you see the cities being very proactive in wanting to get the investment and wanting to do the project, and they've got a lot of the energy to drive the project. The federal government is setting the rules and providing the support and providing encouragement and financing and funding. So a lot of the money flow is coming from the center to encourage and enable local governments to deliver. And so that's sort of at the other end of the spectrum. And this is a picture of one of the challenges of that when you have the central government sort of driving the overall discussion around PPP, is that central government, when it sets up its PPP processes, they tend to be quite complex. So this is a picture of the Indonesian process, and the challenge is that there are just a lot of players involved at central government, and each of those players has different roles and different overlaps. And for a municipality looking at this chart, you think, oh my gosh, how am I going to go through this? Do I have to, bounce back and forth to Jakarta to get all my business done? How am I going to get all these different approvals? I don't have the relationships with the Ministry of Planning, the Ministry of Finance, et cetera, that I would need in order to go through this process that a line ministry would have. And so for a lot of countries, for instance, South Africa decided to set up a separate unit for municipal PPP and a separate team. And this is South Africa actually split its PPP unit, which it had for a long time, and then split it into the regulatory function that stays in Treasury, and then this technical assistance unit that goes around and helps different line ministries or local governments think through PPP projects and helps them develop. At one point, South Africa actually created what was called the Municipal Infrastructure Investment Unit, and which was I really liked this mechanism. It's been closed for some time now, but they brought together a group of very creative, commercially savvy, many from the private sector, a team of people who were given a pot of money and sent to go help municipalities drive investment, infrastructure investment, in particular, mobilizing private financing, and so including PPP. And part of this was because they had donor support. So I'm trying to remember who it was, actually. I think it was the US. I thought I had it on the slide. Anyway, I think it was the US, but I'm not positive because the Brits were in there as well. So anyway, they had support from the outside and a pot of money that they could then use to support municipalities developing their infrastructure. And that worked really, really well. And then it slowly, the money got tapped out and the government decided to just sort of fold it. And so they closed it down and sort of wrapped it back into the PPP unit. But at least it got the municipalities a good start on developing these different projects. And they've got some really interesting examples of projects, especially in the water sector and solid waste and other areas, where they were able to do quite a bit under the MIU. India is another really fascinating, and I will let Abhijit correct me because I'm sure I'm going to get my limited understanding, but India, you've got the early PPP program was driven by the planning body and looking at power and then roads. Power sort of slowed down. They tried to do these big, huge projects, which got complicated. Roads moved very quickly, and the road program just exploded. Now power's picked up and caught up. And so those programs have moved well, but they're quite specific models of PPP. And then the states caught on. And so the states are now by far the most creative driver, I think, of the PPP program across India. The states and the cities are launching into really creative uses of private investment, really creative ways of getting incentives to drive the private sector. And so here and I guess from a leadership perspective, you've got this split between central government and local government, and then central government trying to sort of keep up with that, creates institutions centrally to try to, and not wanting to squeeze down on the states, which I think is really good. They're trying to provide resources, to provide model documents, to provide lessons learned, to sort of support the driving of this new way of doing things, right? And now in India, it's not a new way anymore. This is now one of the key approaches that government across India uses to drive investment. And so the Indian government has a whole series of different mechanisms on the regulatory framework, model bidding documents, contracts, all that good stuff, infrastructure acts, blah, 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 to financing and different modes of financing from central government that are then provided to facilitate private investment, as well as working on looking at pipelines of projects, providing advice and input, pushing into new sectors, benchmarking performance, and lots of capacity building, lots of training and helping people learn new things. And of course, advocacy, which is really important. And there again, from that leadership perspective, you become the face of this model. And so not just wanting it to happen and saying, I want this project to be delivered by PPP, but to say that here's why I want PPP, and this is what we're going to get out of this, and here's where I want this to go, and pushing on that aspect. So rather than just give me a deal and give me an investment, which is the easy part, is really advocating for this model and understanding why and when. So it's not advocating to use PPP for everything, because that doesn't work, right? There is only a portion of your investments that you want to use PPP. And it's a relatively small portion. It's no more than probably 25, 30% of your investments would you expect at some point. Now, some countries have pushed that much farther, and the Koreans were getting up to 60%. But, manage expectations and use the model in the right way for the right purposes. Still no questions. I don't know. All right, I'm going to go down the list. This is your last slide, your last chance. So let me give a summary of, for me, the recipe for leadership and leadership writ large, right? So one obviously is government buy-in, right? We're looking at bringing in a model of delivery that is different. When we're talking about our smart cities, and we're looking at technological solutions for complex social and political issues, you need a clear buy-in from government, a clear statement of this is the direction that we're headed, and this is why. Not just I want this, but an understanding of how it's affecting people and how it's going to deliver for those people. Clear processes. Help us understand exactly what we're doing, exactly how we're doing it. This will help your staff. It will also help the investors. So there's consistency, there's transparency, everybody's treated the same way. If there are funny special arrangements for special people, then it falls apart, right? It is no longer a program, it is a selective approach. Select the projects well. Don't cling on to crazy ideas to start with. Crazy ideas will always come up. But if you push for the more risky, the more difficult projects, those projects are much more likely to fail. Too many of those failures in the early days of a program can undermine the program. And so be careful about selecting the right projects and the ones that are more likely to succeed. Plus, of course, the money you spend on preparing projects that aren't appropriate for PPP is going to be wasted. And spend the time and the money to prepare well. So instead of grabbing a project and saying, all right, I want it done in 6 months, which is not going to happen, give the time and the effort to deliver projects well. And that may mean preparing now a bunch of projects that will only come onto the market over time. And that will then give you that sense of calling on a project and having it done quickly. But in the background, you've done all the preparation. You've gotten things ready for all these different investments that you know that you will need. And I know from the World Bank, this is not surprising, but keep it open and competitive. It's tempting to just grab a company. Microsoft is a big, huge company. This is exciting. We're going to work with you on this. And that can work in some areas. As a general rule, keep it open and competitive. Private sector will deliver better if they have to compete. They will come, you'll get new investors coming if it's open, because they'll see what the rules are and they'll be able to come and know that they'll get an equal opportunity to bid. And it's going to save you a headache, because anything that's not open competitive will be challenged by the next government. The next people that come in will say, oh, those guys did this funny deal with so-and-so. And not only do you look bad, but then it wastes all the effort and all the time and money that you've spent developing this project, because it's now been unwound because it looks funny. It looks dodgy, because instead of being open, competitive, transparent, you've done a deal someplace. And one might ask, on what basis did you do that deal? Now, even if you are the most above board and perfect and pristine, questions will still be asked. And monitoring and implementation. It's very tempting to go through all the preparation, to go out to bid, to get your investor, to sign the contract, to get the financing, and say, yes, we've won, success. That's just the beginning. The hard work comes. It's just like marriage, right? You get everything you ask, you propose. She says, yes, you're so excited. You get the wedding ready. Your family is all over everybody's a family and friends and everybody. And you have this huge party and everything's wonderful and you have such a great time. Can you then say, great, marriage is a success? Of course not. That's the fun part, right? The big wedding. Now you got the hard work of every day working together, learning about each other, growing together, developing that relationship. And the benefits are fantastic, right? As that partnership is sealed. But if you don't work on the partnership, then it can be a mess. So work on it. Monitoring, implementation, working together, partnership, conflict resolution. So that's my recipe. And yes, a chat question. Hold on. Yeah, I'll leave it on that just to make it interesting. Okay, yes. Desmond asks a very important and very real world question. I've said very nice things about consultation and stakeholders and working together, and it all sounds lovely and wonderful. The reality is that a lot of those stakeholders will be the ones holding you back. And that's the way it's going to be. There's no avoiding that. Every project will have some stakeholder who's holding it all back. And each situation will be different, and there's no one answer to this challenge, right? And it will happen every single time. Somebody will be holding you back, and often it's very surprising people. It's people that you didn't expect, or people in places that you expected to be supportive. From my experience, it's better to have those people inside the tent rather than outside, generally. Right? Try to bring them in, try to make them part of the solution, try to win them around. it's worth it. If you can bring in a critic, and that critic becomes a proponent, a supporter, or even just neutral, that's a very powerful signal to everybody else in the project. But it's also the process of engaging with that critic can be very helpful. Sometimes the critic's right. Sometimes the issues that they're raising are absolutely right. And it's difficult to admit it, and you don't want to. But unless you really push yourself to engage with everyone, you will miss that. And you might miss something that's really going to help your project. In other cases, they're just obnoxious individuals and they don't want to play ball. And then once you get to that point, and this is my, and Abhijit, if you don't mind, I'll pop this over to you next. If you, at some point, you try to bring them in, you work with them, you do your very best to bring them inside, but it may be that you just have to live with them as a critic. And then and at some point it may be overly toxic to have them on the inside, and they may need to be removed from the project, and they will continue throwing eggs at you from the outside. So I'd have no simple answer. But Abhijit, you know everything. Give us your simple answer. How do you deal with obnoxious critics who are amongst the stakeholders?
I don't think I can add anything to what you've already said, Jeff. I mean, these are realities. There will be some stakeholders that will pull you back, and you have to figure out a way around, moving ahead with them. Leadership plays a large role in that, in terms of how do you address some of these, stakeholders? How do you bring them in? How do you take them along? Is a very important role that leadership plays. But there are a couple of other questions that have come in since then, and if you want me to give your voice a bit of a rest, I could possibly move on to the next one, which is about getting approvals from states. So there's a question from Zahari which talks about several levels, or several steps. You need an approval from the state, and that sometimes prolongs decision making. Any advice on how to improve this situation? Well, the only thing that, I mean, this is again, the reality. There will be levels of approvals that we will all have to seek, whether it's from municipal to the state. If the state is doing a project, sometimes from the central government. That's how the lay of the land is. Not very much that we can do about that. But I have found it very useful when I've worked on projects, is to involve, if I worked with municipal projects, is to involve the state government as early on in the process as possible, rather than wait till the time that everything is cooked and we need a final approval, and you go to the state for the final approval where, the last I has been dotted and the last T has been crossed is very difficult, because if the state then comes back with suggestion, the whole process gets prolonged. So it's useful to have, regular interactions with the state government at critical points of the project development process. So the state, you already get their buy-in, they're a party to the process, they've given their feedback, you've heard their inputs and you've incorporated them. So when the stage of the final approval comes, there are hopefully no surprises, and B, the process then within the state government moves much faster. So that's I think from what I've seen, that I can share with you.
On that question, actually, and that's a really interesting one. We generally advise central governments to provide a separate regime for municipal PPP, and to the extent possible to especially for smaller projects where the liabilities are not large, to provide a simpler approval process. And partly that's to help municipalities, because it's just too difficult to go back and forth to the capital, and they may not have those same relationships. But also for the central government PPP unit, because the last thing they want is every single municipal PPP project landing on their desk to be approved 4 times during the life of the project. Just too difficult, too much work. And in some countries, we've set up parallel central government PPP units. So for instance, in the Ministry of Home Affairs or in the Prime Minister's office or someplace like that, a team whose job it is to support municipalities and help them deliver PPP, but also to oversee and check on things and make sure that everything's okay. And that way they become more familiar with the municipal governments and the relevant people in municipal governments. They become more familiar with the type of projects that municipalities tend to implement. And they're closer to it, so it's easier then to do those, make those approvals. Oh yeah, so I just wanted to link in with Harif's comment about conflict in PPP projects and good leadership and not waiting to resolve it in court. And you know, I told you guys before we started that I'm a lawyer by background. I used to work in big law firms supporting sponsors, and I've worked on a few arbitrations around PPP projects. And so, you know, when you let the conflict become a dispute and you let it go to court, the only people that are happy are the lawyers. Now, it's important to keep lawyers busy. We want to give business to the lawyers, which is a wonderful thing, but it's much better to solve all this stuff in advance. And I'll link it to my I have the same challenge in my marriage. If I let a conflict brew, it's going to get ugly, and I've got to really discipline myself to talk and to open up those issues and to deal with those things as soon as possible. And it's not easy, right? I don't want to deal with those things, but it's so important. So thanks, Hara, for chiming in on that. And then the other one was from Alex about new technology, and especially around the smart city. That's a tough one. There are different models of risk allocation and managing risk that you can use to help. But it's just so, I mean, the number of proposals I've seen for central and municipal governments from people with new technology that will revolutionize the world and solve all your problems. And I don't know, recently saw one for a solid waste management, where the amount of waste that would go into the landfill was almost zero. Literally almost zero. And you just look at that and think, man, this would be wonderful if it existed, but there's no way you can bet the government's balance sheet on something that has not been proven. But at the same time, you've got, you know, you want to create all this new technology, new approaches, and there's a careful balance to be made from my perspective. And again, Abhijit, I'll be very curious as to what you've done around these things, but there's a balance to be made where the government just needs to buy in technology and test it and play with it, which we talked earlier about those innovation labs, which is basically partnering with a private company to play with ideas. But then if you want to scale it up, what do you do? And are you stuck with that partner? And can they then hold you hostage because they own the technology? And you know, how do you enter into that contract, and how do you manage that? How do you encourage scaling up without government taking all the risk, which is a likelihood? And it's difficult to get that balance right. And I don't have a magic wand for that one, but what's been your experience, Abhijit?
So yeah, again, I mean, I guess it depends on what kind of projects and what kind of technologies you're referring to. But the municipal solid waste project that we talked about a couple of days back, when I was presenting the case, we had a similar situation where there were a couple of companies that came in with some technologies and said, this is what we can offer you. And they were revolutionary, really. But I think the only condition that we put in the bid document was really saying we are technology agnostic. This is, you bring whatever technology you want. This is the output that we want, the specification of the output in terms of the service level agreement parameters that we want. But you have to show me that project implemented somewhere in the region. Now, you could specify it as Malaysia, you could specify, I mean, that would be nice. If not, you could specify it in ASEAN or something like that, where within the region with similar characteristics of the project, in my example, similar characteristics of the waste, and how people work with it. You know, you show me an example of an operational of that technology. The risk otherwise that the municipality carries, I mean, part of it is financial, and you could find ways to get around the financial risk. But the big reputational risk is huge. I mean, imagine implementing a project with a certain technology, and then because it didn't work, having to pull it off and get the new guy. That reputation risk, to my mind, is huge, much bigger than the financial risk. And therefore, I think to balance this whole thing, you know, in the net balance of consideration of adopting new technology and the reputation risk, I would probably go with any new technology that's been implemented in and around and you've seen that work, go ahead with it. Anything that is esoteric and has worked 10,000 miles away, you know, don't be the first one to touch it.
Yeah, and implement it at some scale as well, because it's yeah, we've seen a few where they've come up and said, oh yeah, we've done it, and it's at a university someplace, or it's, you know, some situation that's not consistent with yeah, and of course someone has to be the first city to implement it, but you don't want it to be you necessarily. Um, and this said, that then there's the next question of what do you do when it is new technology, and when there is something brand new that you want to do. Um, and you know, I think that, and as the question indicates, it's that balance between the two to make sure that the risk and the incentives are balanced. The difficulty with using a PPP model is that it's a 20, 30-year relationship, and it's solving a huge problem for the city and whatever it might be. So if you're looking for brand new technology to solve your waste management in the city, that is massively risky. But if you want to use new technology to solve the waste in a new suburb or a new part of town, or, you know, if you can ring fence it and isolate it. But again, I wouldn't sign on to a 30-year deal with somebody on the basis of technology that you haven't seen proven. And the difficulty is not that it's going to fail, right? The failure is one thing, right? And it fails and you have to bring in new technology. But the political backlash is going to be massive. And then you're going to be criticized for having gone in with this crazy new technology. And that may bring down the whole project, right? It may undermine your program. There are all kinds of different ramifications. And then also the liabilities. And for a lot of these deals, when you're stuck in with somebody for 20 years, you know, you don't want to be stuck with that relationship. And then the process of unwinding a PPP is, you know, not fun. So I think the central advice still stands. Don't go in with new technology. Make sure it's proven in the region, not someplace far away, not some place with a completely different economy or different nature of service or whatever. Something similar, so that you are comfortable that this is likely to work. We've got a question from Atira about subunits in municipalities. So the only thing that I've seen with a subunit being mandated to deliver projects on their own without approval up the chain tends to be very focused, right? With amounts of money, amounts of liabilities, scope of engagement, period of engagement. You know, you may not want them doing longer term. Maybe it's, you know, limited to a certain number of years. And this is at central government level, but in Tanzania, no, sorry, this is Indonesia. In Indonesia, the Ministry of Home Affairs is empowered to approve municipal borrowing for anything less than, I think it's $10 million. Anything above that, the municipality has to go to Ministry of Finance. And so it's a softening of that approval regime, but it's very specific liabilities and very specific amounts. And then they're only allowed to do that to a certain amount. For each city has its own debt model, so that it can figure out how much it's allowed to borrow etc. So there are a bunch of different criteria. But it's true that from a leadership perspective, you need to be very careful about what kind of mandate you give. You want to empower, you want to trust, but you also want to regulate and oversee. And then translating the municipality's local plan into a PPP concept framework. Now, I think what you mean is that the local plan, the municipality's planning process, and that the PPP concept framework should be part of that. And that there I completely agree. I mean, any local plan will look not just at what you want to do, but how you want to do it. And PPP should be part of that thinking process, but also realizing that at the planning stage, it's very early. So you might well say, I need to build a new waste treatment center, a new sanitary landfill. We're going to use PPP to do it. And that may be your initial assessment. But don't forget that as you dig into the project, as you get more information, it may be that PPP is not the right model for that. So be very cautious about locking yourself into any instrument, right? Whether it's public or private or different forms of financing. Be very open to whatever it is that your data indicates, and be flexible enough to adjust to whatever the best solution is for the city from time to time as the project's been being developed. Have you read this next one, Abhijit?
No, I'm reading it now. It's the longest one.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is, I mean, parking projects are tricky. I've worked on a couple of these where the city wants to change the parking regime. Either people are parking illegally or people are parking all over the place and it's causing congestion. And so there's a desire to fix that parking regime by imposing fines or clamping cars, setting out parking. And in fact, in a couple of cities, we've brought in private investors to help set out the system. So, painting the lines on the streets and setting up parking meters and simple things like that, and then managing it and implementing it. But at the end of the day, the policy regime is down to the city. And you cannot rely on the private sector to deal with all of the social backlash that you're going to get when you tell people they can't park in their favorite spot anymore, or they have to park in a polite and appropriate manner, or they can't double park, or all those kind of things, right? All of that is, and it comes down to this is my car, and we all have this sense of our cars, and they're so important, and this is a reflection of my mobility and my empowerment, blah, 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 blah. All really important issues, all very sensitive, none of which PPP is going to solve. It can help, but it's not going to solve. And at the end of the day, it comes down to you. So I think the trick is to parallel the policy change and implementation, not just the idea, but implementation of the policy change with the PPP project. And let me bring it to a simpler level, which is toll roads. A lot of countries want to build toll roads. They build the road and then they want to start charging tolls. And the people say, I don't want to pay tolls. This is a publicly financed, this is a project that's used some public money, because they usually do. And even if there's a PPP, I don't care. I don't want to pay tolls to drive on this road. And so we always have this conversation very early on with governments. Please set out a tolling policy. Please communicate with people what your tolling policy is going to be, and then stick to it. Don't get to the build of the road, and then the toll gates open, and then you feel bad for charging tolls. And so you leave it free for a year, and then you try to charge tolls later. That's really difficult. Now, if you have a very strict, I'm going to give you 3 months of free road, and then we're going to go straight into tolls, and this is how it's going to work, and you're very consistent, great. But the tendency is to respond to people's anguish, which is going to happen, and not have it planned and structured, and it just helps people to have a plan. It helps people to know what's going to happen and to be clear and concrete and consistent. So we've always pushed governments to set their tolling policy, to communicate it with people so that when the toll road is built, then we can implement. It rarely happens. And then the toll road gets opened and it's a mess.
Can I add a couple of pointers, maybe, if I can call them that? One is I'll continue on Jeff's example on toll roads. India today probably has more than 10,000, 15,000 kilometers of toll roads. Malaysia has quite a few themselves. I mean, in your country. In India, when the first toll road project was conceived, the government spent at least a year or year and a half before the first toll road came into operation in communicating with people right from the top, right from the Prime Minister level, explaining to people this whole concept of vehicle operating cost, about how a much better road would save you costs in fuel, in your axle, in tires, in et cetera, and the rationale of how the toll was linked to the savings in vehicle operating cost. They even went on to say, listen, we're actually saving you more money than what we're going to charge you. And they were, of course, one of the key things on the vehicle operating cost was also the time. You know, as a truck, you could move, you know, maybe one extra trip for every 5 trips because this is a much better road. You save 20% of the time, you make more money, et cetera, et cetera. So communication, as Jeff talked about the policy, particularly the parking policy within a city that you're talking about, which would, you know, start 3 months, 6 months, 9 months before you actually implement it, get people to already buy into it, tell them the advantages, benefits, et cetera, of that. The second point, and over the years across different parts of the world, I've seen that, particularly because some of these PPP contracts are long. I mean, they could be as short as 10 years, but as long as 30, depending on the kind of project that you're in. But even 10 years is a very long time. You know, we know so many things change. One of the things that increasingly when we work on PPP projects is to tell governments and the concessioning authorities on thinking through what kind of a mechanism you want to build in, which lets you go back and revisit some of the critical elements, almost, for instance, in this particular instance, the policy on parking, for instance. If you want to go and revisit, you already set up a mechanism or a process for that, saying this is the committee that will look at it, which will have, you know, a PPP partner present in there. This is the process we will go through it. This is how we will calculate the cost and benefit of that. Who pays for it? Who doesn't pay for it? So that when you want to go back and revisit, you already have an entire process laid out, including costs and benefits. So nobody challenges a change in a PPP contract if you've already foreseen a possible change and you've drawn out a mechanism of how you want to address it. So this is something I think we're increasingly looking at. I mean, there are lawyers who are on either side of that, whether it's something that you should do or not do. I know of at least a couple of contracts where we've actually got that in, and let's see how that works. If and when, we hope not, goes to court, we figure out how it goes. But yeah, I think there are a couple more questions now.
The point you made about helping people understand how a new road is going to benefit them. And I think that's really powerful. If you help people understand that the new parking rules are not there for the city to be mean to people. They're not there so that the city can make more money from tickets. They're there because illegal parking causes congestion. Congestion costs the city X amount every year. That by parking better, we're going to be able to reduce that loss by X. This is what we want to achieve out of this. We're going to be able to, you know, increase speeds, motor speeds within the city. So you're going to save this much time by having less congestion. All of those kind of things, just so it's super practical. So people realize that when I'm parking illegally, yes, it's convenient for me for 10 minutes, but I'm actually causing disruption for the entire city, for all my neighbors, and I'm causing them to lose money, and I'm causing myself to lose money. Because all my goods are more expensive because logistics costs more money. Everything takes longer to get anywhere. You know, we should be able to gain X amount of jobs, all those the sort of econometric analysis of the impact of in reducing congestion, I think that'd be really powerful. Okay, I think that's blah blah blah. I think that's the end of our questions on the chat so far. Shall we go into the module 1 responses?
Yes, Jeff, you can go to that module 1 and module 2.
Cool. So
Yeah.
Abhijit's got a nice list of all of some of the challenging constraints that
So
have
is
been identified in these.
Abhijit going to do it verbal, or he want to share something?
No, I'll just do it verbal.
Okay, that's fine. All right.
We probably, between Jeff and me, have a bit of a discussion on this.
Okay.
Rather
Fantastic.
than slides. So
Okay.
yeah. Okay. Thanks.
All right.
Okay, Jeff. So what I've done is I've looked through all the municipalities who've sent in their responses to the tool 1, which is one on municipal PPP readiness. And basically it's the responses being strongly agree, disagree, strongly disagree, and they've all ticked on each one of the questions, one or the other. So what I've done is, rather than taking it for each municipality, what I've tried to do is on each one of those 2 tools, which is the municipal PPP readiness and the project concept appraisal tool, identify the top 7 common issues or challenges that came up. And maybe what I'm going to do is read them one by one out for you. And then maybe you can comment on it. If I have something to add, then I'll add on it. So the first bunch of questions on the municipal PPP readiness tool were around the municipal accounting systems, right? And clearly across all the municipalities that have responded, the municipal accounting systems are strong. They get them audited. There is good resources in terms of financial and accounting systems and so on and so forth. I think the couple of challenges or issues that have come up is, one, that not necessarily all the accounting systems are based on an accrual basis. Basically, that if there are some liabilities which are longer term liabilities, they're not necessarily captured in the accounting. And the other challenge that I think that came up is that within the municipality, not all of them have a public debt management system in place. So there isn't a body or a department or a function which actually controls how much debt or how much liability a municipality can take on. Sometimes it's not debt as in direct borrowing, but my whatever commitment to pay you is also an obligation over a certain period of time. So 2 issues: accruals basis accounting, and 2, the public debt management function may not necessarily be as robust as desired.
Great, and obviously these are super important issues, which we're seeing at the moment with governments around the world having massive debt problems because they've played fast and loose with their debt levels. But also we were talking before about giving more mandate to the municipality or to specific departments to move projects and to drive projects. The stronger that set of rules is around liability management, debt management, the stronger those rules, the easier it is to give those mandates to sub-elements of municipal government, or for central government to give those mandates to local government, because those rules protect from the worst abuses, or abuses is the wrong word, the worst risks, right? And the potential for signing the wrong, getting the contract wrong and creating a liability that is going to bite the government later is huge. So you need to be very careful about this, and having a team whose job it is to watch out for this, to monitor and manage, reduces that risk significantly. And it's also a big part of the credit rating process. So if you do want a good credit rating, if you decide to go that direction, this will be an important part of the discussion we'll have with the rating agency.
So I just wanted to add one point on this one, is this element called contingent liability. Right, I've found municipalities having a lot of problem, not so much understanding it, but capturing it, which is really saying a contingent liability is something that will occur and will come onto a municipality if some event occurs. So for instance, let's say on a municipal solid waste project, I don't know why I keep going. Let me pick another one. On a water supply project, let's say where a PPP partner actually withdraws or draws water from a river and then supplies it to a city. Now, upstream somewhere there is a dam which is governed by the central government or the federal government, and something goes wrong with that dam because of which water is not available to draw down, to draw in and supply water. Then the contract would say that the PPP partner has to find other sources, tanker, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there is also a liability if such an event happens that comes onto the municipality to pay Y% more, or for that one day pay, a couple of $1 million or whatever it is. Now, these kind of contingent liabilities, and usually in a PPP contract, there are many of them, for different events. It's very important for municipalities to try and identify them and then quantify, okay, if this event happens, then I may have to pay X to the partner, and build that into the budget. That's usually what the public debt management function is about, which is identifying not only the direct liabilities, but also these contingent liabilities and putting them into the budget so that everybody is aware of what the possibilities are. So I think that's just one other element I wanted to. Jeff.
Sorry, I lost you. I can't hear you.
Sorry, do you want to add anything, or should I just move on to the next?
Yeah, no, just one other thing on that contingent liability. Extremely good point and really challenging. And obviously the difficult part is what's the likelihood of it happening? And how in the world do you figure out what the likelihood of, say, a drought? Right now, a drought we can look at because we have actuarial tables looking at drought, repeat of drought over the past 50 years, whatever. But a lot of the other things that contingent liabilities are connected to, non-payment by somebody, or it's very difficult to identify the likelihood of it happening. So if there's a potential $10 million liability, do you put the full $10 million on your balance sheet? Do you only put the percentage that is likely to happen? Who decides what is likely in that? And it's a tricky question. And there are a lot of different approaches to it, to how to manage it. Obviously, the most conservative is that you do dollar for dollar. So you do the $10 million appears on your balance sheet, and in some countries you have to put a reserve against it. You have to have a fund of money that will protect you in case this actually happens, and which makes those liabilities very expensive. And you've got a big pot of money sitting around against those liabilities. The other way to do it is figure out the likelihood of it happening, have a process for figuring that out, that likelihood, and then apply that to the amount, and then set that aside amount every year, and then that sits in an account and is ready to go if it needs to. Or you just put it on there as an amount in the budget and put it as a note so that people are aware of the liability. But it's a tricky one, but really, really important. Thanks.
Okay, the second one is around borrowing by municipalities. So a lot of the municipalities have not borrowed at all. Some have, but mostly borrowed from banks. Whoever's borrowed has borrowed from banks. Almost none of the municipalities have done a bond issue, and none of them have a credit rating, whether domestic or international. And the associated one are that some of the municipalities I also saw are not very clear about the rules and guidelines related to municipal borrowings. Some of them are very clear, strongly agree that there are set rules and, so on and so forth. This is what we need to do. But some were not sure about what exactly governs borrowings. Now, I don't know if that was because of, how the question was framed, or is it genuinely a concern. But yeah, so borrowings, no from banks, many, no borrowings, no bond issuances, no credit rating. And then this about rules and guidelines.
Yeah, so thank you. And it's that's pretty typical for a lot of the world, that municipalities don't necessarily go in for large borrowings. They look for transfers internally and they manage their resources accordingly. They have their own source revenues, but otherwise the actual borrowing. And then when you do borrow, you borrow from, state-owned banks or local banks that are friendly, who you work with, and so they're your partner, and so they provide you with loans on a nice basis because you give them a lot of business. And once it gets to this more project focused borrowing, or to bond issuances or global borrowing, where it's less familiar, the lender is less familiar to you, it gets tricky, and then it becomes an arm's length relationship, and you need to follow rules very carefully and make sure that everything is set up and aligned in the lending agreements, and you're very cautious, and this is a new skill set for most municipalities, so it's not surprising. And unfortunately, I don't know the rules in Malaysia around municipal borrowing. I don't know what is allowed and what is not. Most governments restrict it very carefully, and obviously because you don't want to, in the United States, we had a couple of pretty large sized cities, and Detroit almost went bankrupt, and they're still teetering. So these are major cities that are having liability problems, debt problems. We had a couple of cities that actually went bankrupt because they couldn't pay their debt anymore. And so you need a whole system of managing those liabilities. What happens if, is the central government obliged to step in and pay the debts of the city? Do you want them to borrow just locally? Do you want them to borrow internationally? Do you want to allow them to take on foreign exchange risk? So if you borrow in US dollars and your tax revenue are in local currency, and there's the exchange rate between the two changes, then all of a sudden your liability for your debt increases in the currency of your revenues, and that can create real problems. And it's a tricky one to manage, even for the most sophisticated of governments and companies. So not surprisingly, central governments are often cautious about that. So that's not surprising that this is a challenge. It does not mean that you can't do PPP or that you can't approach these projects, but it does mean that those investors and lenders will be asking a lot more of these kind of questions. If they know you borrowed money, then they know that those banks have already asked these questions, and that you've demonstrated an ability to manage these relationships. So it's not a condition precedent to being able to engage in a PPP, but it will raise a lot more questions. And you should raise these questions yourself internally. You don't want to be engaging in this kind of project where you have a concrete commitment over a long period of time without the mechanisms internally to manage those liabilities.
Just, I don't know if it's funny or not, at that point in time, we thought it was a funny story. But in 2005, I was working on a sewerage project in an Indian city where IFC, the World Bank's private sector arm, was willing to lend $100 million from a recent municipal fund that the IFC had put together in Washington, D.C. And we had worked on the project. IFC's due diligence processes are very tough. I was advising the municipality. Very tough. We went through all of that. It got cleared. Everything fine. We came to the final loan agreement between the municipality and me. We had negotiated the loan agreement. Great. And finally, we just sent it to the lawyer to, take a look at the loan agreement before we sign it off. And within one day, he came back and he said, "How are you even borrowing?" So we said, "Why? What's the problem? Municipality is allowed to borrow." He said, "Yes, but in India, municipality is not allowed to borrow from a foreign entity, any foreign entity, whether it is in local currency or international currency." And we said, "Okay, so it must be a state government law. So let's go to the government and state government and get it changed." And he says, "No, it's written in the constitution." If you want to borrow from IFC, you have to go all the way to the parliament and get the constitutional amendment, which typically in India, I think the fastest one has got 6 years, or was it 7 years to get a constitutional amendment done? And then to convince 3/4 of your parliamentarians as to why this is important. We obviously never did the deal, but that was the first time we figured that out. So it is not surprising for me when some municipalities say we're not very sure about what the borrowing norms are, because nobody reads the constitution when you look at can a municipal borrow or not. So anyway, that was then. The second thing was about credit.
Hold on, I need to point out the shocking thing about that story is that you waited that long to talk to the lawyer. I'm insulted.
The second thing about this is about in this point was about credit rating, and just one word there. Credit rating is not only important when you want to borrow, but even if you're wanting to get any engagement with a private sector entity where there is some liability and the municipality has to pay something, a fee or for the service or for an equipment, a product, whatever, it's very useful to have a credit rating, because what it shows is the municipality's ability to adhere to its financial obligations, that it will stick to its financial and has the capacity to do that. It gives a lot of comfort to any private entity that is working with or transacting with the municipality. And it, by and large, there is enough evidence to show that with the credit rating in place, the competitive bid would be more competitive, and therefore the price of what you're buying would reduce. I don't have the straight number in terms of what percentage, but it definitely has shown to reduce in terms of price competitiveness. Okay, I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to move on. The next challenge, which I think pretty much was there across all municipalities, is the municipalities seem to have strong capacity with respect to specific areas like accounting, finance, engineering, strong capacity. But one of the areas where they all came up were saying capacity is a challenge is this whole area of project development and implementation of PPPs. Saying as municipalities, we just don't have capacity there. So, Jeff?
What is the answer? Yeah, so this is always a difficult question. You can hire in consultants to help you with this kind of capacity, but you need to be able to manage them. You need to be able to know when they're giving you good advice and when they're providing you with the right resources. You could create a team that will do this within your municipality, but often that, unless your municipality is very large and very wealthy, that may not make sense. And unless you've got a lot of different projects you want to do. And so where do you get this capacity from? I think in the initial stages, you will definitely hire in support. You may get support from central government. Central government already has a certain amount of this capacity. And so would they provide you with support to help you manage these consultants and develop the capacity locally? It's a tricky one, right? Because it is a very specific skill set. Once you've brought your people through the first few deals, then they'll start getting this capacity. But still, you'll want to bring in outside advisors. We did, I told you about St. Petersburg in Russia when we were helping them set up this PPP unit locally. We helped them with a road and a tunnel and a light rail project and an airport. And in the airport, for example, the government was brand new to PPPs. This was the first one they started with, was the airport. And they didn't know what to do with it, how to manage it. And they hired in international advisors. We had Citibank on financial advisor, Mott MacDonald, which is one of the big international consultancies on technical, and a law firm called Dewey LeBoeuf, which is a merger of a US and UK law firm. And so you had all these, high level, very sophisticated advisors, and the government didn't know how to manage them. And so they actually asked the World Bank to support them. And so we sat next to the government and we formed part of the advisory team. And we provided a bridge between the advisory team and the government to help the government understand the advice that they were being given, why they were being told this, how this was relevant. And by the end of the deal, the government had already picked up a lot of this capacity. They were really engaged. they were very, much part of this and wanted to use this as a learning process. And so it was a really practical way of helping them develop this capacity. But it certainly took a lot of effort.
Okay, I'm going to move on to the next one, which is some of the municipalities don't seem to be sure whether they can enter into long-term commitments and whether they can take on multi-year fiscal commitments, which is really beyond the tenure of the current elected government. So there some municipalities believe they can, and it was strongly agreed, and some were not sure. So because this is so critical to doing any PPP, I just thought I'd put it up.
That's interesting. We had the same issue in Indonesia. And actually there, the local governments are not allowed to undertake liabilities past the tenure of the current city government, of the current mayor. And so they couldn't sign contracts beyond that period of time, but they could and they couldn't, and legally it was kind of unclear, but politically it was not allowed. And so we've had to try to move the needle on that and identify types of contracts, types of projects. And here again, it's very useful to have a standard procedure, standard process, standard terms and conditions that you put into your contracts, so that central government can get comfortable with the idea that they're allowing governments to undertake liabilities beyond the tenure of that local government. It can be tricky, but it'd be interesting. So what are the people listening? Are municipalities allowed to undertake long-term contracts? And if so, what are the rules? When can you do that? Now remember, if you don't send us something in the chat, Anusha is going to choose one of you and all of a sudden turn on your video and you're going to have to answer us. I'll give you a couple of seconds because I would imagine the answer is not going to be a very 2 sentences of yes, you can. Okay, Anusha, what do you say? Should we pick somebody randomly out of the crowd?
Yes, you could. All right.
Ori, yalah Ori.
Ruzaimi?
Yang Ori.
Now we'll know if they've just got their video on, they're watching YouTube in the background.
Video boleh? Ruzaimi?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right, I'm here.
Okay, Jeff, you can ask him.
So tell us, are municipalities allowed to enter into contracts that last longer than the mandate of their government?
Okay. To answer that,
Yes.
a difference between the system of government in Malaysia and also in Sarawak is a bit different compared to other countries. I believe like big projects and certain tracks we have to get endorsement from the state government. And for municipalities in Malaysia, I think there is no issue whether because the administration of the municipality, we are not what they call an elected municipality, but rather appointed by the state government. So basically, the final say will be the state government. Does that answer your question?
That's interesting. So you've got a status of you refer directly to the central government, and so you bypass this challenge. But for most cities in Malaysia, for large projects, they would need approval from central government.
Not central government, but state government.
State government. Okay.
Yep.
Okay. That's a little bit easier. So it's not as high up and it's not as distant, but it's.
Add a question.
Please.
Can I pose a question to you? Okay. Now
Yes,
for
please.
Sarawak, for municipalities in Sarawak, the ones in Nanjong, we in Sarawak, municipality doesn't have planning authority. So the planning is with the state government, right? Cities in Semenanjung where they can plan for land use and so on, and they can even give what you call temporary permits for certain land use. But for Sarawak, we have to refer to the state government. So I would like to ask, does this occur in cities where experience in, and if you have, maybe you can how they overcome that.
Yeah, I mean there are a lot of different, there are various models of relationship between city, state, and federal and central government, and some of those models are give power to the city. Some of the models require this, have the state make all those decisions, and in a lot of countries it's mixed. It depends on the state. And the US, for example, has a whole series of different models depending on which state you go to and which city, in fact. And the larger cities tend to have a lot more autonomy. St. Petersburg in Russia is a state. And that's true for a lot of large cities, is that they are state governments, not city governments. And therefore they have that flexibility. They've got much more control as far as budgeting, et cetera. I mean, to be honest, I don't know if there's a solution, so to speak, to the challenge of you just have to go to your state government to get everything approved, and that can be challenging. But I think one of the options, or one of the things that that certainly we've explored in different countries, is creating a program that is sufficiently robust and sufficiently clear that the state allows the city to do more of its own, gives it a mandate to do more, to make more decisions on its own, because the state is confident that the program is robust and therefore the risk is managed. And so they're willing to give a little more control to the city because they're confident that they're not going to create a problem. I don't know if that helps at all, but you know, that otherwise the advice would be bring the state in early, make sure they're part of your project discussion early on, and maybe get the state to set up a PPP team. Get them to develop that capacity, and that way they are the ones that provide you with the support and help you drive these projects, and then you're providing them with a solution rather than vice versa.
I know of one example, not exactly similar, but there is one state in India that I worked with where for all industrial land, the planning happens at the state government level, not for housing, not for residential, and but just for industrial. And the way the municipality handles it is that at the beginning of every year, or before the start of the financial year, I think it's about a month and a half before, they kind of discuss the annual plan with the state government planning department of where and what industries and so on and so forth. And of course, they keep it a bit loose in terms of what the state government, what the municipal government is expecting in terms of industries, how much allocation they will need, where, and have that whole planning kind of a discussion. And then based on that input, the state government kind of develops a master plan for the city, for the industrial land usage. And if there is any change in land use, etc., all of those are discussed at the beginning of the year. Not to say that you can't go back if you wanted to change, but they do this once a year at least to get the ballpark or the framework in place, and then maybe do, I don't know if there was, whether it was already scheduled quarterly or if there a need arose, they used to go back and kind of meet. But that's one of the things you could think of. Okay, should we move on to the...
I have one kind of like statement from Mr. Harif. All right. Here we are subject to state authority or government, we do have some borrowing this year. We have to get approval from the state, and the state will look at our ability to pay back the loan. So it's a statement that he's giving.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's usually how it is, almost everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah.
So again, I'm just looking at the time. We only have 15 minutes left. So I'm going to move on. I had a couple of other points on the municipal readiness tool, but I'll move on to the project concept appraisal tool.
Great.
Pick up one or two of those issues there. So the first one there is, while most municipalities were pretty strong on being able to estimate project costs for projects, they weren't necessarily as strongly or as good when it came to estimating operating and maintenance costs for life cycle and for assessing demand, both in terms of volume as well as revenue. So I think, Jeff, comments on that?
Yeah, demand is tough, right? And especially if it's a relatively new asset, and it's something that at this early stage of the project, when you're just looking at a project idea, you're in planning stage, and you're just looking at concepts, you're not going to have a huge idea. You're not going to have a clear idea of demand. Now, there are different ways of synthesizing that demand. So looking at different aspects. I mean, for something like parking, you're going to have a feel for how many people park on the street, how many people live in the area, work in the area. You can get a sense of demand from that. If it's a bus terminal, you'll know the movement of buses, and hopefully you've got a good idea of demand, because just understanding the basics of the project, you're going to need to know demand. It may be that you know more about demand than you think, and that there's more data out there than you think, because there are different ways of testing for sanitation, sewage. Sewage is a tricky one, especially if you're putting in a whole new system. But you can look at the volumes of water used and use that as a base for how much sewage you're going to get. For solid waste management, again, you're going to have to look at there are numbers about typical amounts of waste generated per household, and look at those kind of things. But at this early stage, you're not looking for absolutely exact numbers. You're looking for a sense of what this demand will look like.
I have an interesting quote to share on what Jeff said. This was very early in business school that one of my professors said, and I kind of took it to heart and remember that. It is better to be approximately right than precisely wrong. So, most things about infrastructure demand, like Jeff said, you would have a reasonable ballpark idea of what the demand is going to be, right? And that usually is good enough. I mean, even for private partners to go in and bid, because it's very, very difficult to project, okay, if you're talking about a parking lot, whether on an average cars are going to be there 1 year, so you're going to get 20 rotations or 16 rotations, it's almost impossible for people to be able to project that 3 years hence, forget now. So on those, I mean, you normally take an approximate number, and those numbers work, you go ahead with the project and how it is. I'm going to move on to the next one, and this is about municipalities are by and large not sure about the sources and costs of financing, and also the availability. So there was this whole section on sources and costs and availability. So they're not necessarily sure about that. Yeah.
Yeah, and again, not surprising, especially if you're just starting out. Looking at PPP and financing for these kind of projects is different than the financing that you would normally get into your municipal borrowing or other sources of financing for municipals' requirements. At the same time, finding out rough numbers is relatively easy, right? Get on the phone, talk to your bank, the banks that you usually work with, get a sense from them, and they'll be able to give you some basic ballpark numbers to put in there. But realizing that at this stage you're guessing, right? And I really like, Abhijit, I really like that quote. I'm going to be, yes, that's a really, really good one, because it's better to get a sense of what this is going to look like. And the whole idea at this point is just to challenge yourself. Am I totally off base here? Is this totally a crazy thing to be thinking of? What do the revenues kind of look like? What do the costs kind of look like? And just don't forget about financing costs, because they're a huge part of the cost of the project. And when you look at the cost, don't forget that if you finance a project and it's, you know, construction of a bus terminal, and the revenues from the bus terminal aren't going to start for 2 years while you're building the bus terminal, but you're going to have to borrow the money during those 2 years. So the interest that you're going to have to continue paying interest, and it's going to be rolled up during those 2 years, because you're not going to have any revenue to pay it back. Those are called interest during construction. That can be a serious part of the cost of the project. So don't forget all of those kind of pieces. And, you know, again, the question here is not to give an exact answer, because you won't have it, but don't forget these costs when you're thinking about your project, because if you don't and you only think about them later, they will bite you.
Quick 2 comments on financing. One is, the reason financing for one of these PPP projects is important and to look at sources and costs is because, depending on the project, 70 to 80% of the project cost is funded by lenders. The equity portion, which is the private partner himself, is not bringing in more than 20-30% of the total project cost. And off record, I'll tell you the chances are at 0. But anyway, that's off record. But 20 to 30%, and the lenders bring in 70 to 80% of the project cost, right? So it's important to think of how financiers, you know, what the cost of that would be, and so on and so forth. The thumb rule that we use now, for different projects, it varies a lot. But for some of the larger projects, the thumb rule that we use is the difference between construction costs and the total project cost, which includes what Jeff was referring to: interest during construction, consulting services, bringing engineering, is typically somewhere between 20-25%. So if your construction cost is 100, the project cost is going to be about 125, 127, something in and around that. Of course, like I said, it differs from project to project, but that's a thumb rule that we sometimes use. And the last thing, over and above sources and cost of financing, is what is the security that some of these financiers are going to look at? You know, what will make them comfortable from, you know, their risk point of view to be wanting to finance this, is another element that in PPP projects is very important and critical. Anyway, moving on in the interest of time. Some municipalities are not sure about the legal regulatory framework pertaining to PPP. Jeff?
So the legal and regulatory framework.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I have no clue either, but and you know, again, this is a question that you're going to need to look at, and before you launch into something, find out if how the legal regulatory framework works around your PPP project. Are there clear rules? Is there any impediment? Is there anything you need to think about? And this is just to implant in your mind that there are a series of rules and that may be different from what you're used to using. And don't go running forward on the basis of a traditional procurement process using a PPP, because there may be some significant differences, and you just need to remind yourself of that in the early stages. Go to your lawyer and ask them what the rules are, and I'm sure they'll have to do a little bit of searching as well. But just make sure that you don't run afoul of that, even at this early stage of project preparation.
Quickly moving on to the next one. Some of the municipalities seem to have PPP projects where the project costs are less than $1 million. You know, there was this question about whether they're less than $1 million, and I know why we put that question in there. So go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, so it's a tricky one and this is a problem, a challenge, an opportunity for municipalities across the globe, right? You have a variety of different sizes of project, and many of them are small. There is I guess the common practice is that projects below, some people say $10 million, some people say $5 million, done with a PPP because of the cost of advisors and consultants, and when you don't have that capacity in-house, that it might not make sense to do a project that small on a PPP basis. And that you should think carefully about that before going forward for a $1 million project, and think about the costs of the advice that you'd need to set the project up in the right way. For $1 million project, are you really going to get a firm to come in and design your PPP agreement? That alone would cost you a decent chunk of money, and is it really worth it for $1 million project? Now, there are a few ways of doing this. You can pool projects together. So if you have 10 of the same kind of project, or 10 projects of $1 million, and maybe you put them together as one project, so that the same firm delivers on all 10 of those projects, but aggregated, then makes sense to pay the money to have the PPP agreement drafted and to do the due diligence, etc. You can have across different municipalities. And we've done this in different places. Again, can be tricky, but if there are 5 municipalities who want to do bus terminals, and they're small bus terminals, each one's $2 million, but you could hire a firm that would deliver all 5 bus terminals. That gets tricky because you've got to coordinate across the different municipal governments, and so there's some extra cost involved in that. But I think just the general warning is, be really careful with small projects. It may not be worth the effort to put them together on a PPP basis.
Okay, there's the next one, and I think we've addressed that question, so I'm going to just read out the challenge and then move on, is about implementing projects that do not have examples of similar projects having been implemented in the region. And some municipalities are relying on new projects that are relying on new technologies. So, what do you do? I think we addressed that just a little while back. So I'm going to move on to the next one. Some municipalities have expressed this concern about, they're not necessarily sure whether the private sector partner is going to operate and manage this project better than the public sector, better than the municipality themselves. So, how do you address that?
That's a tricky one on several fronts, right? First of all, you've got a lot of private companies coming in and claiming that they're wonderful and they can do everything incredibly efficiently. Second is, it's often difficult to admit internally that you're not operating the asset as well as you could. And so explaining to the state government or the central government or even your mayor why it is that somebody else is going to do this job better than you will can be tough. Also admitting how much it costs you to deliver the project. And generally speaking, public procurement ends up costing much more than private procurement. And because of the way the rules are set, the way the system works, also because you start in public procurement, we tend to go out and hire a contractor before the design of the project is mature in our own heads, right? We're still thinking about things, and we're still developing an idea, but we've already hired the contractor because we want to show how fast we are. And then the contractor starts work, and then we start changing things, or we start adding things, or you go out and you get approvals, and all of a sudden all those people that are getting approvals have different requirements, and that just adds to the cost of construction projects. And if you look, and this is for the most sophisticated countries, right? The UK, when they developed their various tube stations and new tube lines, the Jubilee tube line ended up costing 3 times what the government originally thought. And all because, and I should add, another challenge for government is, when you want to do a project, your bosses will ask for your assessment of the cost. You need to put a cost in there that is affordable, so that it looks affordable, even though the actual cost may be several times that much. And to get approval, you have to be incredibly optimistic as to the project cost. And so you go in with a low number, and then what comes out the other end and after construction is a high number. So there are a number of reasons why the context of public procurement pushes against efficiency, ironically. And so it's hard often to admit that your own system is going to end up costing a lot more than what the private sector will be able to deliver. So it's tough on all of those fronts, but I think it's worth in the process looking around at some privately run facilities and what you think, are these well done or not? Would they be better done? Can you ask the question of yourself, are you really delivering as efficiently as you could? And of course, the argument internally is not that I can't do it, so I'm going to hand it off to somebody else, but rather, I think I could do it even better if I had a partner from the private sector. And that together we're going to be able to deliver a much better service and a much more efficient service. But that is a really tricky process.
I think just one comment that I wanted to add is, the possibilities of establishing structures and systems to incentivize the private sector and or penalize is far more flexible than you will ever have for the public sector. When you are bidding a project out and you're structuring a project, you can define that incentive and penalty systems. Just to give you an example, in India, we used to have road projects that on an average, a 2-year project would finish in 4 years. Right? That was pretty standard for public sector. When the private sector came in and started building roads on a PPP project, 2-year project was getting over in 2.5, or little more than 2, but still more than 2. And then the government threw in an incentive that if you finish it earlier, I will let you start tolling 6 months in advance. And suddenly 2-year projects were getting finished in 1 year and 3 months. And you kept wondering. And then when I was working on a project in China, they were finishing 2-year projects in 9 months. And so it's you can incentivize private sector in ways that the public sector may not. I mean, you may not have the flexibility to incentivize the public sector in the same manner.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a great one in California, wanted to use that same system, and so there was a big earthquake, do you remember? And then so they had to rebuild part of this freeway, and it was a big project. And they said, well, for every month that you finish early, we'll give you X% more. And of course, the private sector went full guns and finished really early, and the government ended up spending a whole lot of money, but they got the project early. But it was turned out to be quite expensive. So be careful how you apply those incentives, because they can end up being expensive.
Okay, so that's really all that we have on the from project concept appraisal tools to talk. We are 2 minutes beyond our finish time. So I hand it back to you and Anusha.
Great. So from my perspective, I just want to thank you all very much. Thank you for sticking with us for all 4 days. It's been really, really interesting, and appreciate you taking this time during a crazy time in our lives to spend this time with us. Hope this has been useful. And please do send us whatever questions or comments. I know we've got a follow-up session coming in July, which I think Anusha, at the end of July, which Anusha will tell you about, and a test, which she'll also tell you about, which is coming later today. But thank you again so much, and it's been our pleasure, our privilege. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff and Abhijit, for a wonderful session. All right, this wrap up the training part, but we have a post-training which we'll review and run through the assessment, which we'll email you by end of today. So I hope everybody can go through the assessment, because at the end of the whole training, we will give you a certificate, which is signed by MITE and World Bank. All right, and our next post-training is on the 28th July at 10 a.m. I hope you all have enjoyed our training session and have a good day. Bye.